From river to ocean, mountain to plain, campfire to hearth, may the first people, and I'm on the Wiradjuri people land.
Ghana people?
None at all.
Literary mariner.
Those who have cared for this land, be blessed. From breath to song, from step to dance, may those who follow your song lines guide us on the journey of living honorably in this place, learning to respect Aboriginal heritage. From greeting to amen, from silence to discussion, may our time together join with the voices of the first people of this land, past, present, and emerging.
We're going to have, in a little while, Chris Marshall, who has joined us from New Zealand, talking about strength and weakness, some disconnected musings on fragility as a principle of Christian witness and community. But for those who don't know a lot about Chris, I want to do a brief introduction. This comes from the first AAANZ gathering that we had, predates AAANZ, back in 1995. This was in Sheffield, Tasmania, at a place called
Southland.
And we had called it a call to gathering. We were at that time still talking about Australasia, which is a term that has kind of gone out the window. But this was a much younger Chris with David Shank, who was our director with Eastern Mennonite Missions at the time, and who over the years was a bit of an expert at working at peacemaking among Christians and Muslims, and did quite a bit of writing about that. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see a much younger version of Mary and I between the two main speakers at that conference. Chris has gone on to do quite a bit of writing and teaching and working in the area of restorative justice. This is, I think, one of your latest books, Chris, Compassionate Justice, an Interdisciplinary Dialogue with Two Gospel Parables on Law, Crime, and Restorative Justice. And then Beyond Retribution, a New Testament Vision for Justice, Crime, and Punishment. And then two other books, All Things Reconciled, Essays on Restorative Justice, Religious Violence and Interpretation of Scripture, and the Little Book of Biblical Justice, a fresh approach to the Bible's teaching on justice. And I know we're going to have a Q&A a little bit later with Chris, but I wanted to get a question or two in from the very beginning. But if you had to recommend a book for people to read from among your writing, which, and particularly among those four, would you pick? And then this is maybe the same question asked in a different way. Which book would you like to be remembered for, or which would be your legacy?
I don't know how to answer the last one. I think the book that probably had the biggest impact was the one in 2001, Beyond Retribution, in terms of people referring to it and thinking that it's helped the conversation around divine justice. The book on the two parables, I think, is perhaps even closer to my heart. I think those two parables, the parable of the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, are so well known. I found them absolutely absorbing for living in, really. Initially, the parable of the prodigal son, I looked at it for reasons other than restorative justice, but I very quickly recognized that the kind of restorative journey mapped onto the parable. And the Good Samaritan one, I think, is the most extraordinary story ever told, really. And it's had an enormous impact, and it still does. People still refer to this category of the Good Samaritan. So, I mean, that's the book that I think I got the most out of working on. It's probably too long, and it's probably too technical in places, but I think it was an important book for me.
So we will open it up for your comments, and then toward the end, we'll have a time of Q&A if you're all right.
Thank you, Mark. Well, it's nice to be with you in this virtual kind of way. I said to Matt that the advertised blurb that I provided to him was far too grandiose, and the reality being nothing like as profound as the blurb maybe implies. What I simply want to do is highlight one very familiar concept or theme that I've been pondering myself recently over recent years. It's a theme that will not be new to you, and it will be not one that is unfamiliar to the Anabaptist tradition, although I won't refer to Anabaptism at all, really. And what I'm talking about is this notion of finding strength and weakness, of finding power in the midst of powerlessness, life in the face of death, resilience in the midst of fragility. And that word fragility is one that I'll come back to later on. So this thought is all pervasive in the New Testament. It's at the heart of Paul's understanding of the cross. And it was also at the heart of his understanding of his own experience, his own daily experience as an apostle. So in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul recounts a powerful visionary experience he had had 14 years earlier. It's not the Damascus Road event, it's another experience he had had of being caught up into, his words, the third heaven or paradise. And of, again, his words, hearing things that are not to be told and that no mortal is permitted to repeat. So an experience of rapture that he could barely put into words. But when he awakens, if you awaken from a vision, I don't know, come round, he is left with this mysterious thorn in the flesh, an affliction of some kind, and people have speculated as to what it might be from the earliest of centuries. Was it a sickness? Was it a psychological issue? Was it a relational issue? We don't know. But this thorn in the flesh that God is going to use, Paul says, to keep him grounded, to use our terminology. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul's speaking here autobiographically, speaking of an experience. But the notion of power and weakness also has a collective or communal impact as well. And I want to just share what I describe in the blurb as disconnected musings on how both these dimensions, the personal and the communal, have been important to me over the last few years, and I still sort of wrestle with, I guess. So for those who don't know me, I retired fully from my academic job about this time last year. I spent the first half of my teaching career teaching in a theological college in Auckland, and the second half teaching in the Religious Studies program at Victoria University in Wellington. So about 19 years at the university, I spent 10 of those in religious studies and roughly 8 or 9 in the School of Government, where I had this dedicated professorial chair in restorative justice. So that was kind of my swan song out of my teaching career, those 10 years. Working mainly in the public arena, engaging with policymakers and practitioners and so on. It wasn't a religious role as such. So Margaret, my wife, and I have now entered this third age, it's been called, with all the difficult to answer questions that come with it. What do you do now? Are you going to write another book? And those sorts of questions were always difficult to deal with, because the sort of subtext is you've got to be doing something to show your worth. And if you're not doing something, you're just lazing away on the beach. Nearly 7 years ago now, I suffered a quite significant stroke, completely out of the blue. No sort of factors that would suggest it was coming. I was, thank God, spared lasting physical or cognitive impairment, but the main impact was on my speech, which was my main tool of trade. This is what I lived by, was my ability to teach and speak. And I found it a very grueling challenge returning to teaching and to public speaking and to restorative justice facilitation after that. There's been improvement over the years, and people sometimes say that I'd never guess that I've had this problem, but the legacy does remain. And funnily enough, in a way that I don't fully understand, I find spontaneous conversations and social interactions really difficult now. It's something to do, I think, with cognitive overload, or my brain having to work at several different demands at the same time. And my fluency is very unpredictable, and that can be quite debilitating in many ways. Now, I mention this because at a personal level, I have had to come to terms with experiencing fragility in what was previously my strongest suit. I mean, this really was beyond the writing and beyond the practice stuff. It was my ability to articulate what was going on that I think was my primary gift. So what once came easily now never does. What once brought huge satisfaction now often brings frustration. I used to have this phrase going around in my mind, I used to be able to do this much better. What you're hearing is really B level and a good deal of mental depletion. So during the early days of my recovery, I was at home for 3 months and I spent a lot of time reading the New Testament aloud to myself. And I went looking at, particularly for accounts where Jesus healed the mute, surprisingly, or where Paul lamented his own lack of rhetorical skill, something that he was actually criticized by the Corinthians for. But the passage I found particularly helpful was the long story in Exodus 3 and 4, where God appears to Moses in the burning bush and calls him to lead Israel out of captivity in Egypt. And Moses is terrified at this prospect. And he raises, in this very long story, he raises a whole string of objections, 5 in total, as to why he could not possibly accept this job. Thank you very much. And each of which God patiently, except God's patience runs out towards the end, but he patiently responds to the problems that Moses raises. But his clinching argument, Moses' clinching argument, for why he couldn't possibly serve as God's appointed spokesperson is because he lacks the verbal skills to do the job. Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor even now that you have spoken to your servant. But I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Now, to fulfill the mission, I have to be a man of words, but I'm not an orator. And my inability to speak as fluently and eloquently as I would like to is what really troubles me about this mission that you've just called me into. So it says, I am slow of speech and of tongue. The image is literally my tongue feels heavy when I speak. It's really hard to get the words out. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, this has been a long-standing problem, nor even now that you've appeared to me in the burning bush. I've still got this problem. You haven't cured my speech impediment. And I found that I could identify, well, I don't know whether you can identify somebody as great as Moses, but I found I could identify with Moses' insecurities about his speech difficulties. But it was God's response to Moses that became my anchor in this, especially this early recovery stage, and in many ways still is. God responds, "Who made man's mouth? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go and I will be with your mouth and show you what you are to say." He later says, "Go and I will be with you. I will be with your mouth." He doesn't promise to remove the speech impediment that Moses feels he has. Instead, he says that he will be with him and he will help him. So God usually doesn't appear to take our struggles and weaknesses away by miraculous feats, so we become superheroes. His preferred strategy is to remind us, as he reminded Moses, that as creator of all, God is greater than our limitations and can work with us in spite of our limitations, as long as we're prepared to work with him in trust and obedience. And I find that idea of trust and obedience really hard. I find that a constant struggle to actually know what it means to trust God when he's so darn unpredictable. Or to use Paul's language, God's grace is enough for us because God's power is made perfect in weakness. I don't know what that means. Does it mean God's power becomes more evident in our weakness? Does God's power become more obvious in our weakness and more, I don't know what it means, but Paul says God's power is perfected in our weakness. And he knew this from his personal experience. And he knew it primarily from the cross, but he also saw the same truth demonstrated in the composition and nature of the early church. So writing to the Corinthians, he says, "Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one may boast in the presence of God. Of course, that description of the first generation church bears little resemblance to the powerful, influential, wealthy, status-driven church of the Christendom era, or even to the mainstream churches in our society in our day, up until about a few decades ago, where the church still had, in our youth, a degree of social respect and influence and a lot of resources. But those days seem to be over. Christian congregations, seminaries, mission organizations, intentional communities are now much smaller and more precarious than they ever were, certainly in our experience. From a purely sociological point of view, I think it'd be fair to say that the church in the West, as we have known it for centuries, is dying, and no one knows what it's going to look like in the next 50 to 100 years. Nobody really knows what it's going to look like. All our previous evangelistic efforts, our church growth strategies, our leadership training programs are unlikely to stem the current decline. Why is that? Well, there's obviously lots of reasons why the church is struggling in modern secular society. But at least part of the reason may be because the cultural soil that once enabled the church to bear fruit has been poisoned by the church itself. That the church has poisoned the fields by its own failure to embody the gospel. This is a metaphor that I came across in a book by a man called Brian Rustin, which I recently read, called The Death and Resurrection of the Church, came out a few years ago, which mainly focuses on the North American scene, which is always fascinating for, I think, kids down here to see and to be, in many ways, deeply disturbed and horrified by what we see. So he's mainly speaking to that, but I think his analysis really is more general in application. The church, he says, has been corrupted by its judgmentalism, its hypocrisy, its partisan politics, its civil religion, very, very prominent in America, of course, consumerism, by its reduction of the gospel to, you've heard this phrase, moral therapeutic deism, that the gospel is all about making your life more comfortable. And by all these things, the church has lost all credibility, almost all credibility. So it cannot expect to get a sympathetic hearing anymore, at least on a wider societal or institutional level. I know these are sweeping generalizations, and there's a recent survey done in New Zealand of public attitudes to the church, and people could grasp on some rather positive things people were saying, but I'm a bit suspicious, really, that it really is as positive as it sometimes appears. This man, Brian Rustin, writes, "The average person no longer trusts the clergy or holds us in high regard. We are seen as managers of a hypocritical, homophobic, racist, oppressive, and certainly antiquated religion that has nothing to offer enlightened and liberated minds. We have failed to deliver on our promises of peace and the love of Christ, instead offering up judgmental, hypocritical, and divisive systems that don't seem to serve personal needs any longer. And so people are leaving, and they will continue to leave." So he uses this idea that this problem within the church has poisoned the wider society that we're in, and it will probably take generations for the wider soil of Western society to recover its potential fertility, its potential responsiveness to the gospel again, because it's now so confused by our track record. In the meantime, he writes, we must give up our obsession with growing large, significant, powerful churches or anything else grandiose, and instead must simply desire to be faithful, accepting along the way that our numbers will be fewer, our power and influence will wane, and the features that we've taken granted as normative for church structure and polity for so long will go away. But this is not bad news. As the church structures that we've known die away, he says we will be offered this opportunity for new life, for resurrection, for the resurrection of the church out of this death thrall that it's in. And he thinks that what will emerge will look much more like the church's origins in the pre-Christian era than it does previously, where it's more resembled the church as being part of the establishment. And most Anabaptists, of course, would agree with this. Of course, we can't go back in time, nor should we naively try to recreate the New Testament church, whatever that was. It's usually a fantasy of the New Testament church that we romanticize. The last 2,000 years of Christendom have brought enormous benefits as well as enormous problems. It's brought profound theological, liturgical, ethical insights and institutional developments. God's still been at work in the church over the last 20 centuries, whatever its massive compromises have been. So as we yearn to cast off the shackles and failures of the past, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can't wipe the slate clean and start all over again. Just as the final resurrection of our bodies, of the body of Jesus, transforms rather than jettisons the material body, so presumably the future resurrection of the Western Church will transform or repurpose the past to face this completely unique cultural order that confronts us of a society that lacks any reference to the transcendent at all. That seems to be historically unique for the last couple of hundred years. So we might look back, but we can't go back. But at the same time, having said that, the very reason that the early church canonized these 27 first-generation documents in the New Testament is because they are presumably meant to provide a measuring rod for our current fidelity to the apostolic gospel. So, I mean, just as Indigenous communities, you've probably come across this expression a lot. Indigenous communities speak of walking forwards by looking backwards. They say that, Western people look forwards to the destination and walk towards the future, whereas Indigenous people are always looking backwards to the ancestors, to the tupuna, to the whakapapa, to the origins of their existence. And I think in the same way, as the church reaches forward to the new creation, because the purpose of the church still lies ahead, we need to always look back to the foundational experiences of Jesus and the early church. And that's why I think we have the New Testament available to us. So in Wellington, where I live, I belong to a small community of faith. It's now roughly 20 adults and about a dozen children, all under the ages of 13 or pre-teenagers. This community has been through its ups and downs over the past 15 or so years since it began. We've been part of it for maybe the last 9 or 10. And after some recent sort of personnel changes in the community church, we had to assess whether we still had enough people and enough energy to keep going. We use this metaphor, who's in the waka, who's still in the canoe? Some had got out in the canoe, and that's fine, but who's still in the canoe? Do we have the energy to paddle again or not? And that question lay open for quite a long time. And initially we sort of committed ourselves to the next 3 months or the next 6 months, or we'll commit ourselves to Easter and then we'll think again. So we had these short-term goals as we sought to discern together what our viability was. As part of that process, in our annual retreat about 3 years ago, I gave 2 talks on the meaning of the concept of the church. I thought this might be helpful for us to have some idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about our future as a church. So one of the talks is on the church in the New Testament or in the apostolic era in those early decades that we can read about in the New Testament. And the other was on the church in the post-apostolic period prior to the conversion of Constantine. And I drew there mainly on Alan Kreider's amazing book, Patient Ferment. Have you know this book? I mean, a number of you have read it. It's one of the very few books that I've read twice. I read it when he first gave me a copy, and then I read it again in preparation for this retreat. And in preparing both those talks, what struck me most forcefully and unexpectedly was this notion of power and weakness, this idea of growth and resilience despite precariousness and fragility. I began to wonder whether fragility and vulnerability and precarity are maybe essential to the church's existence in the world, to its success. So let me just briefly illustrate what I mean by that. Some comments on the New Testament and some on the following couple of centuries. So we often say that the day of Pentecost was the birthday of the church. It was more like the graduation day of the church, because the church was really born in the community of disciples that assembled around Jesus. But the birthday of the church, the time when Jesus' discombobulated group of followers was empowered by the Holy Spirit and charged to bear witness to Christ in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That's Acts 1:8. And thereafter, almost the entire New Testament is devoted to tracing the growth, the spread, and the multiple challenges, both internal and external, that this fledgling religious movement experienced. From the very start, it appears that the most common word that they used to describe this new messianic community was the word ecclesia, which is the word that's translated usually as church in the New Testament. So Acts 8:1 speaks of how severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, the ecclesia in Jerusalem. And perhaps this was the first messianic group, the first Jesus group, to use this term ecclesia to describe itself. Now, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know at the front. I'm reminding us of things that we already know. But I guess the most important thing to know is that this word in the New Testament never refers to a building or to a sacred organization or to a sacred place. I mean, all that came later. It always refers in the New Testament to a localized gathering or assembly or congregation of believers, meeting for a sacred purpose of witness, worship, prayer, and instruction. Perhaps this word was chosen because in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it was the word that was used to translate the idea of the assembly or the congregation of Israel. And the word synagogue was also used to describe the assembly of the people of Israel. And in fact, the first Jerusalem believers could quite easily and naturally have called themselves the synagogue of Christ. There's a kind of reference to that in the Epistle of James, but they didn't seem to use that phrase for their gatherings. They preferred this word ecclesia, partly because the word synagogue had been increasingly associated with dedicated buildings and authority structures. Didn't begin like that, but by the first century, it was often referred to a building or a dedicated place. And the early believers didn't have buildings or their own dedicated structures. So what Paul calls the church of the living God always refers to a tangible community of believers meeting in a particular geographical location that for hundreds of years was usually private homes or domestic settings, typically around the meal table, who regarded themselves not as an organization, but as brothers and sisters in Christ, as a family, and an increasingly diverse family. So the word church, when we come across it in the New Testament, and this doesn't apply to the way we talk about our churches today, like the Avalon Baptist Church, we don't tend to use it in this sense. In the New Testament, it is fundamentally a relational category, a familial term, not an organizational or institutional category. Of course, as we know, in the book of Acts, this young family grew very rapidly in size and in spread. The book of Acts, Luke tells us several times of thousands of adherents joining this new community in Jerusalem and beyond. It also spread out from Jerusalem through Judea and Samaria to the major cities of the Mediterranean region and even to Rome itself, which perhaps was what they meant by the ends of the earth. However, that's the kind of that's a story we're familiar with. This amazingly successful, rapidly growing movement that took the world by storm. That's the way we often read the story in Acts. But on a larger imperial canvas, when you looked at, from the larger imperial setting, it remained a relatively small, poor, socially insignificant movement that was distributed across maybe hundreds of small house churches, each probably containing only a few dozen members because houses are pretty small. And, Romans 16, Paul goes through and sort of names these house churches that were meeting in Rome. And yet, remarkably, and this is what struck me in my preparation, Paul could speak of these small, fragile, powerless, under-resourced communities loosely networked together in a sense of mutual relationship and obligation. He could speak of these minor groups in terms of looking at it through the eyes of the Roman Empire, not only as the historical fulfillment of God's centuries-long covenant purposes for Israel, but even as the cosmic revelation of, to use Ephesians 3 language, a mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things and now made known through the church to rulers and authorities in heavenly places. So, I thought, wow, talk about meekness and majesty. These tiny, fragile, marginal communities of faith were, in Paul's eyes, manifestations of God's cosmic triumph. God's restoring reign on earth has begun in Christ, is shared by his followers, one day will make all things new in God's afflicted creation. But in the meantime, these are small, fragile groups bound together by the relationship of love and commitment. And the task of these small communities, whatever their size or whatever the location, was essentially fourfold. And this is my theology, this is my ecclesiology, that these small communities were there for four reasons. One was to be the first beneficiaries of God's restoring power, to be the first to benefit from God's liberating presence in his kingdom, and therefore a sign of hope for everybody else. Not a sign of damnation for everybody else, but a sign of hope. It's happening. You can see it's happening amongst us. Therefore, be hopeful. That's the first thing. The second was to be the guardian and proclaimer of the story of what God has done in Jesus. We are entrusted with a true story, and we must tell and retell the story down through the generations. Stanley Hauerwas once said that the only thing that makes the church different from any other community in society is not its piety, nor its moral virtue, or its charitable deeds. You can find those things in lots of different communities. He says the only thing that makes the church unique is the story that it gathers around, the story that defines it and its responsibility it has to tell and retell down through the generations. I think the third thing about the purpose of these small communities was to be a preview or foretaste of God's future society in the midst of this present evil age. And Paul uses this really apocalyptic language, that the church was a microcosm of what God intends for human society as a whole. In other words, a community that strives to embody in its own life and relationships and values and practices the restoring, reconciling, healing character of God's reign as a foretaste of what's to come. And then fourthly, I think these communities were there to be an instrument for God's restorative work in the world, to be agents of reconciliation, justice, peacemaking, and forgiveness in a violent and cruel world. Put simply, these churches were to be relational communities of worship, witness, service, and accountability, bringing glory to God and hope to the dying world that they lived amongst. And none of that requires statistical or organizational clout. None of it. The New Testament churches totally were lacking in both numbers and institutional power, and yet they flourished and they actually had an enormous impact. They grew and spread. And this growth and this spread was partly attributable to the missionary endeavors of people like Paul, the apostles, especially Paul, but also the other apostles, who went from city to city proclaiming the gospel and planting these new churches. But it wasn't all due to them. I mean, the church at Rome, which is arguably the second most important church after the church in Jerusalem, probably began by returning travelers just sharing their faith with their neighbors when they got back to Rome. And the gospel was planted certainly not by Paul's missionary endeavors, but maybe not by anybody's apostolic endeavors, but just by people sharing their faith, because these early Christians had this compulsive desire to bear witness to others about what they had experienced. Things, of course, got more difficult for the church once the Roman authorities started noticing it, and it took quite a while for the Romans to notice it, with Emperor Nero launching his vicious persecution in AD 64 against the church as a convenient scapegoat. We know that Rome was infinitely tolerant of religious diversity. It wasn't what the Christians believed that was the problem. This dissident messianic community enjoyed no official recognition or protection, and so it was very vulnerable to violence and suffered violence. And yet again, despite its marginality, it grew very rapidly. And this takes us into Alan Kreider's work. And I just want to pick out some of the things that he covers in his book. By the beginning of the 4th century, it's estimated, it's only an estimate. I think Alan thinks it's an overestimate, but it could well be close to the truth. It's been estimated that between 8 to 10% of the imperial population was already Christian. That's between 5 and 6 million people. So, that's rivals the number of people in our society who claim to be Christian in any kind of committed sense. Which means, if that was the case, it means that during the previous 250 years, the church had grown at 40% per decade, enough to make the modern church growth movement's eyes water. So, in other words, the church succeeded in bearing witness to the ends of the earth and becoming a significant force in the lives of millions of people well before Christendom, well before the Romans muscled in on the party. And it did so without the resources and social prestige that the church subsequently inherited. And so if we ask, as historians, secular historians have asked, why is this? Why did the early church grow so significantly? And the first thing I think we need to just be aware of, and as people have been raised in the Western Christendom mindset, we've got to realize just how remarkable this reality was, how unexpected it was that this movement should have grown and spread so widely, because nobody was ever compelled to join the church. Invading armies didn't come across and pass decrees that you had to now become a Christian. That happened subsequently. I remember once going to an icon display years ago, Russian icons, and one of them said 10 something or other, all Russia became Christian, because the law was changed. And so that didn't happen in the pre-Christendom era. There are also powerful disincentives from joining this movement: risk of martyrdom, rejection by families, public ridicule, gossiping, punishment for unbelieving masters. There are lots of good reasons not to join the church. So the question is, why did it happen? What was the key to the early church? By that I'm talking about 250 years or so, apparent success. And I think what's striking for those of us who have been raised in the kind of broadly evangelical mainstream background, what's really striking is that this growth did not depend on the methods that the modern evangelical or church growth movement have relied upon. There were no public evangelistic campaigns, for example. That simply did not happen. From the mid-60s on, the church was a prescribed superstition, so public witness was dangerous. The closest the early Christians came to public testimony was when individual martyrs gave witness to their faith during interrogation or before their execution. So there were no Billy Graham campaigns in the early church. There was no planned missionary strategy. There were no missionary training schools, no missionary societies. There were no trained and accredited evangelists. There was no iconic missionary heroes. There was no second Paul. There was no one who occupied a role tantamount to the role that Paul had and who replicated his missionary endeavors. There was no appeal to the Great Commission in Matthew 28, because the early Christians thought that had already been fulfilled by the first apostles. There were no seeker-sensitive worship services. Now, this is really countercultural. There was no attempt to use worship services to attract unbelievers. In fact, quite the opposite. From the late 2nd century onwards, non-believers were barred from Christian gatherings, especially from the Eucharist, with deacons sort of serving as bouncers at the door. There were no cafe churches, no music festivals, there were no alpha courses, there were no bring a friend to dinner events. There was no attempt to lower the barriers to joining. To use a modern language, there's no attempt to be inclusive. That's our term. It was quite the opposite. If you wanted to join the church, you got interrogated by the elders, and they only would let you in if they were convinced that you're putting your life right first of all. So this is quite remarkable compared to what happened either in the first generation, the New Testament generation, or what happened afterwards. It's quite remarkable. And in a sense, I mean, Alan doesn't say this, but this is what I take from it. In a sense, it seems to me that the early Christians felt no pressure to save the lost, because they saw salvation as God's responsibility, and their task was to be co-workers with God's work. And they knew, both from scripture and from experience, two crucial things about God's saving work. The first was that God is incredibly patient and long-suffering, working mysteriously and inexorably over long centuries to accomplish his work of love. We just have 40, 50, 60, 70 years part of that, but God's working on a much larger timescale. They knew that. So Alan calls his book Patient Ferment, because he found out that patience was the number one virtue that these early Christians emphasized. And the other thing they knew is that God's supreme appeal to humanity has been through the incarnation of Jesus Christ, who embodies the truth and teaches how to live the new life of the kingdom. And these two insights, God is patient, and God's already played his, what's the phrase when you play cards? Trump card. You can't use that phrase. God's played his trump card in Jesus. Knowing that, it seems it generated a concern for quality over quantity, for Christian formation over popular marketing, for lived example over verbal enticement. And yet, despite all the barriers they put up to people joining the church still grew in numbers and strength. And even renowned secular historians puzzled over why this occurred. But I think the answer seems pretty clear, and I think Alan's book makes it really clear. The chief reason was the attractiveness of the church's entire package or way of life. People were drawn to these early Christians, I think probably at three levels or three different gateways of attraction. I mean, some were drawn intellectually to the central beliefs of the Christian faith, Christian religion, especially the belief that Christ had conquered death and that no longer is death to be feared. That had an enormous attraction at an intellectual level. Many were attracted to the presence of divine power amongst the early Christians. So Alan's book is Patient Ferment, because within the communities there was a spiritual ferment that was going on. Not that unbelievers could see it, because they weren't welcome, but they could see the results of it in the life of these Christian neighbors. They could see it through healing and exorcisms. It's pretty clear if you read, this is really clear if you read Ephesians, that people in antiquity felt oppressed by predatory spiritual forces. And they observed in these Christians a freedom and a fearlessness that they craved for themselves. But most importantly, they were drawn to the ethical conduct of these early believing communities by the way that Christian conversion, which was spread over many years, it wasn't just easy believism, it was many years that this conversion occurred, created better people. And the things that they especially noted was the way they showed hospitality to travelers, the way they shared food and resources with the poor and the needy, the way they visited prisoners and the sick, the way they rescued exposed infants and cared for widows and orphans, the way they maintained sexual purity and marital fidelity, the way they avoided anger and retaliation and killing of every kind, the way they spoke truthfully in their business dealings and could be trusted, the way that slaves and women were accorded dignity in their communities, the way that they were bound together by mutual love and service. These things were enormously attractive. So the church, if Alan is to be believed, and I believe him, his evidence is pretty impressive, the church grew by attraction more than proclamation. And their attraction stemmed by consciously modeling themselves on the life and teaching of Jesus. Of course, with the advent of Christendom, things began to change quite significantly. Maybe we overemphasized the dramatic nature of that change. I'm sure it was a much more gradual thing in reality, but things did change over those centuries. Growth relied mainly on what Alan calls genes and geography. Were you born into a Christian family? Were you born into a Christian territory? Therefore, you're a Christian. Or by flattery and battery, rather than by personal discipleship and exemplary godliness. Let me just wrap it up with just a few concluding observations. We all know, as Anabaptist inclined people, that Christendom is in its final death throes. And I guess we can feel a bit smug about that, but we probably shouldn't, because with that is going a lot of cultural capital as well. And we know that the institutional church that we are part of maybe, or that we know around it, is reeling in decline and decrepitude in an increasingly pluralistic and relativistic society. So the question I guess we face is, how do we, as churches of communities of faith today, continue to fulfill those core vocational tasks that I outlined a moment ago, despite our fragility and our precariousness? How can we be the beneficiaries of God's restoring power and therefore a sign of hope to others? How can we be the guardian and proclaimer of the story of Jesus to those who are interested in listening? How can we be a microcosm of a society that has the marks of redemption about it in the midst of a society that is increasingly authoritarian and violent? And how can we be instruments of God's restoring justice in the world around us? I read an article when I was preparing for our retreat on recent trends in church membership in the US. Now, I'm sure we could find statistics to match this in Australia or New Zealand, but again, something about the American scene that is just infinitely fascinating to me. But this article found that the average size of congregations in America has been steadily declining over the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, the average size of a congregation of a mainstream church in the States was about 135. It's now down to 70. So the average size is dropping. Though the majority of churchgoers, the majority, go to churches of over 400. They go to mega churches. The average size of communities is shrinking, but more and more Christians are going to large churches. So this analysis concludes, and I quote, Americans are being sorted into two kinds of churches, mega churches and mini churches. We tend to see, and these churches tend to claim, the large churches as signs of success. But most of the attendees at these large churches are spectators and consumers. They are not active contributors. In many churches, however, which I guess we're all part of, as one pastor puts it, quote, relationships matter more than the spectacle of a Sunday morning service. And perhaps the inherent fragility of these small groups that we belong to, perhaps, is a normative part of being a faithful church. So as one pastor in this article, and I quote, with 50 or 60 people, there's a buffer between you and the abyss. Speaking as a pastor, 50 or 60 people, there's a bit of a buffer between you and the abyss. When you get down to 10 or 15 people, there is no buffer. And I think the advantage of being 10 or 15 people is everybody counts. Everybody has to contribute. Everybody's contribution is important. You can't simply be dragged along on the coattails of others because there aren't that many coattails to hop onto. And so, you know, in the situation that we face and the one that I'm part of in Wellington as well, I think the example of the New Testament and of the post-apostolic church may give us some clues and principles that we can emulate, not that we can replicate. We can't go back, I don't think, and become churches as they were in the year 250 or 200 AD, ban people from church and so on. I don't think Alan's material is there for us to imitate. It's there for us to learn from. And if I can conclude with a rather irritating alliteration, which I always say I don't like, but I always end up using, of kind of 7 C's that the early church, I think, embodies and that we, I think, need to continue to try to make work in our situation. The first is Christ, a defining focus on the person, the teaching and the example and the presence of Christ. He is still somebody even our society respects. And so we as his followers need to focus on him. I think, to me, one of the crippling things about the sort of the American, and maybe, you know, what you've found up in Whangarei as well, Errol, of the sort of mainstream churches, is lack of Christology. I mean, it's all about believing in God. It's not about the God that takes shape in the person of Jesus. So that's one thing. Second is an emphasis on conversion, on Christian commitment as entailing this ongoing transforming conversion of being formed over the long haul. The third is the common life that marked these early communities, a common life of relationships, of mutual care, of hospitality, of accountability. The fourth C, and I think this is a challenging one, is catechetical formation. How do we keep telling the story and developing the mind of Christ in people? How do we actually engage in worship, prayer, service, and instruction so people know theology and don't minimize that? Yeah, because that's really important, that we still theologically form people. And you know that is sadly lacking. And those who are informed by the church growth movement, you know, push it to the background entirely because it's not common language. People don't understand it. Let's convert it all into language that people understand. And to me, the early church did the opposite. The fifth C is collaboration and not control. Again, a real Anabaptist idea that we are here to collaborate with God. We're not here to seize control of the mission or seize control of our society. The sixth one is this idea of cultural critique and affirmation, that the early church was critical of the society that was part of, and yet it also affirmed the good things about society. It was committed to the welfare of society even though it critiqued its idolatry and so on. And the last one is this idea of conviction through presence, of mission through attraction, of drawing people to see us as flawed and fragile people who are gradually being transformed into the image of Christ. As fragile as it seems and as much of a failure as we feel, maybe that's the key to God's work in our society over this, this coming generation in particular.
If I may have permission to just extend our time, we usually cut it off about now, but if we can run another 10 or 15 minutes, even though Chris used that illustration of Moses and having a heavy tongue, I think God freed him up to say a lot of good things in this time. The other thing is, if there are things that you feel you missed and you want to go back and listen to again, we've recorded this, and Mary will get this up on our YouTube channel, and you can go back because there are some very good things that have been said over the last little while. And thank you very much for that, Chris. But if there are questions that are burning for you coming out of this, we'll take a few minutes for you. If you need to leave, you're welcome. But while we have Chris in the room, if you'd like to ask a question, we'll give him a chance to respond.
I'll jump in if nobody else is. I'm interested in the use of the word fragility. Fragility to me feels like a response of being easily broken by the circumstances, the context, the pressures. And I wonder if the 7 C's that you're talking about and the understanding of what it means to be a church in any context calls us to not be fragile, to deal with the vulnerability in a way that makes us resilient somehow, so that we can avoid being broken by the pressures.
It's interesting. I mean, I think the idea of fragility probably was suggested to me by Paul's metaphor of having this treasure in earthen vessels, which are fragile, and he means can be literally killed. And I guess the fragility of the early church was as much about physical survival as emotional or spiritual survival. So I guess any word has its problems. And I have tried to understand, I have tried to think about this idea of power and weakness. Are we saying that the weakness is a source of power? Or are we saying that the weakness is something that we just have to accept as a reality so that we can tap into the resilience and the power I'm not sure what Paul means by actually power and weakness, but it's so emphatic in his writings that it's important, but I'm not entirely clear on how to sort of unpack it.
Chris, I've been reading your comments about fragility as being about vulnerability, and that the idea of weakness is actually to be vulnerable and open, rather than, as Matt was saying, the capacity to be shattered, which in some sense is there because we're relying on God, but it's that vulnerability to whatever it may be. In Paul's case, as you're illustrating, some besetting weakness.
I think it's right, because there's still this power within the weakness, which is protection from being shattered in a sense. But
it's an ultimate reliance on God's strength rather than your own.
It links to giving up control as well. If you have to control things, then if you can't control it, it explodes, falls apart, crumbles. But if you don't have to control it, you can be more malleable and flexible so that the bones can bend rather than breaking.
For me, all of this comes back to patience, because for me, what was striking in Alan's book was, he refers to all these early church fathers and others talking about this extraordinary patience, or this most primary virtue of patience, and how patience sits under love. It's very hard to love without patience. And yet we all talk about love, but it's working at that patience level. And that then seems to tap into an incredibly radical trust, because you can't, when God doesn't come, when Christ doesn't, when the Spirit doesn't do things. And so underneath it's this extraordinary patience requires extraordinary trust. And it's a way of being in the world
Yeah.
that's so different, that this lack of control is because I'm. So for me, almost underlying all your C's is actually that extraordinary patience, which then behoves us or calls us into what are the spiritual disciplines that I need to be engaging in so that I have and develop and keep developing extraordinary patience.
What do you think it means at a communal level? Because I think another book I read recently was, I think it was a guy's PhD thesis, it was about managerialism in the church. So sort of the bureaucratic managerial mindset has really influenced the church growth or the leadership training school. And it's all about managing this community so you get the right outputs. And once it's pointed out, you see it everywhere. So how does a community live with patience in a way that's not managerial, but is also responding to what's coming up in a way that's effective? Or, I mean, the words are loaded, but so I don't, I think of our situation, the only way I can think of it as a kind of ongoing collective discernment process.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's it. And that patience of discerning together and waiting for different people to emerge with what their discerning process is. And which is one of your C's about community. It wasn't community decision making, it was something else.
Communal life or
whatever.
Yeah.
And
waiting for consensus.
Yeah.
But it's quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was it you, Chris, that made the comment about the Aboriginal or the people looking back rather than forward, and we look forward? One of the things that I've been realizing with beginning to look at what Anglican Church, Catholic Church calls the saints, is quite often these people were walking a path, not sure where they were actually going. They were just actually allowing God to lead day by day. And certainly part of the Northumbria community's prayer, one of those is actually, Thomas Merton, I think, actually says this: I don't know where I'm going, but I believe that because I am trying to do your will, that I am actually pleasing you. So it's not a matter, I think maybe as churches in the West, we've got to over-organize on being in control. Possibly need to step back a little bit and say, hang on a second, we need to let actually God take us where he wants to take us, not where we want to go.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think in a small group you can do that, but then you think, well, how do you run seminaries and theological colleges? How do you finance missions? How do you finance charitable work? I mean, there's lots of organizational things still need to be done. And I guess the counter tendency is to be so navel-gazing or to be so enjoying the process that you never actually get to do anything. And I mean, we were talking about this at lunch, this how in the spiritual life there is this paradox between God doing all the things that God does, and you don't deserve it, you don't make it happen by being, the right kind of person or praying the right kind of way. So it's God taking the initiative, and yet at the same time you've got to be actively engaged with it, otherwise it doesn't work. And I think this is the challenge, isn't it? And for a small community, it's somewhat easier because we don't have buildings to pay for, thank goodness. We don't have salaries to pay for. We just got relationships and mission. I mean, we do in our community. That's easier, but when you get to a larger group or to, Christian publishing or whatever, I mean, there's lots of things that are going down the gurgler with the demise of the church.
I'm inclined to say maybe some of those we should let go of, but
some we should for sure. But I mean, I'm not sure I'd be in the position of, I don't know. Again, these are a lot of big questions. I'm not sure I'd be in the position of saying Christendom is dying, good riddance. I'm happy that it's dying. I mean, you can say Christendom was based on a huge category mistake, and it's done a lot of harm, but at the same time, God's worked through that. And there are a lot of features in our society as so-called Christian societies, whatever that means, that are good and stem from the leveling place of faith in the culture. And all that is at risk now. And so there's a lot to be said for being a small community, sure. And I think it's interesting that the success of the New Testament churches were played out in small communities. And I think there's something about that that's incredibly important for us today. But at the same time, as the larger institutional structures unravel and collapse, there's a lot at stake.
Yeah, I find it interesting here. I've noticed it more in Whangarei than I did in Orewa, but in Orewa there is Kingsway Christian Church, Christian school. But here it seems that a number of like the Elam Church and the Renew Church, they have their schools and they have their various things associated with their church here. It's quite strong, where of course the more traditional churches, the Presbyterian, Anglican, etc., don't seem to have that anymore. They've dropped that. You know, the Catholic school still exists, but the Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterians don't emphasize that. And I find that quite interesting, because it's almost as if these newer churches are determined to establish this Christendom era all over again. I find their gospel very narrow. That's the challenge, because it's all about the salvation. We've got to get you to believe into salvation, but we don't worry about how you live. That's right.
When Christ came, Israel was the main ground where Jesus was preaching the gospel, and the Pharisees and the religious order was strongly controlled, as probably as it is today. Jesus didn't mind, and Christians didn't mind it getting down the gurgler, because they had rejected the gospel, and God was not interested in people who were given the law, and they had the best law probably to practice so that they can live righteously, but they rejected Christ, who was the expression of God himself. And because of that, God rejected them as a nation, and of course the church or temple was destroyed, and all the hierarchy was gone. And Christians were not worried about resurrecting them, at least Jewish Christians, others probably were, but Jewish Christians went and followed where God took them, and God started building the church. They were mainly focused on that rather than the religious order of that day. In the same way, we shouldn't be worried about the Christendom dying, because it has wasted 2,000 years almost of not practicing what Jesus had essentially said we must be doing. So we should see where God is working and work with him. And as it says in the Acts, that God added those who were saved to the church. They were not apostles doing that, not the other disciples, but God was adding people to the church. If we become more sensitive and open and have our eyes on God working today in a way that he wants and he is doing, then probably it might be better. It will be more fruitful, that another form, or rather the right form of the church or the congregation or edithy or ecclesia will develop, which will be beneficial for those who are leaving the churches, and also who have never been to the church, rather than worrying about the demise of the mainline churches.
I think, I'm not worried personally about the mainline churches. I don't know, but I wonder whether there will be an Anglican in 50 years' time. I mean, the Anglican church is in deep trouble. In New Zealand, the average congregant is over mid-60s, if not older. But most of the churches don't have priests anymore because they can't afford them. So, I mean, I think these larger churches are in for a major change. So I'm not worried about that. I am conscious of what society is losing by its lack of respect or lack of attention to the Christian worldview. And even to say that, I guess, presupposes that there's a good form of Christian contribution and a bad form. And I think a lot of what we see around us as a bad form. I mean, it's sort of, that what's happening in the US in particular with the kind of the Republican capture of the evangelical community is horrific. But that aside, I think over the last 2,000 years, the church has contributed a lot to the social welfare and moral sensitivities of our culture. And who knows what's going to happen as that voice increasingly disappears from public discourse.
That raises the whole question of what it means to be salt and light in a society. It's probably a topic for another event. So next month, 4th of May, we're going to have a conversation with John Roth. He's the project director for the Anabaptist at 500. Anabaptism is coming up to 500 years, and he's directing what is going to be a celebration of that held in Zurich next year. He's professor of history emeritus at Goshen College, which is a Mennonite college in the US, author of 20-some books. And you can read more about the making of the Anabaptist Community Bible. He is meeting with small groups around North America, and they are trying to put together an Anabaptist Community Bible that has notes looking at the Bible from an Anabaptist perspective. And he's quite excited about that. He's also quite excited about having his daughter move to New Zealand, and he and his wife are looking forward to visiting there later in the year. So he is going to be with us on May 4th, quite early in the morning for him, at the normal time for us. Mary will end an Aboriginal blessing, and then we will close our gathering for today.
This was created by a friend of ours, Brooke Prentice, an Aboriginal. May our footsteps on these ancient lands remind us of creation and connectedness in our search for truth. May the gum tree, from its roots to its branches, remind us to dig deep and reach high in our action for justice. May the eagle who soars in the sky remind us of the power in our call for love. May the expanse of the lands and seas, of the sky and stars, remind us of God's timing in our faith in hope. May the Holy Three, Creator, Spirit, Lord, God, Papa, Jesus, remind us of community. So with grace, mercy, and peace, go in truth, justice, love, and hope. Amen.